Hello and welcome to Next Gen Finance, an SEB podcast about sustainable finance. My name is Lina Apsheva, I am your host, and today I am joined in the studio by three very special guests, Samantha Arpas, Lilian and Alexander Stenberg. And one thing that these three special guests have in common is that they all did an internship with our team, the Climate and Sustainable Finance, at SEB over the summer. Alex, Lily, and Samantha will share with us about their experience as summer interns in sustainable banking at SEB and will also tell us a little bit about some of the projects that they have worked on in the past 10 weeks. But let's start with first welcoming you guys to the studio and maybe doing a little bit of an introduction. So, Lily, why don't you start by telling us where you're from and also what you're studying? Because all of you are students at the same time as interns.
Thank you very much. So my name is Lilian, and I study biotechnology at the Royal Institute of Technology, KTH, here in Stockholm, Sweden.
Thank you. And Alex?
Hello, thank you very much for having me. My name is Alexander. I come from Sweden. I've lived in Germany for some time, but right now I'm here in Stockholm studying business and economics at the Stockholm School of Economics, specialized in finance and accounting.
And Sam?
Great. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Lina. My name's Samantha, and I'm from Canada originally, and I came here to Stockholm to study my master's in sustainable technology at KTH with a specialization in management and economics.
Yeah, so as our listeners can hear, all of you have very different academic backgrounds. So I'm wondering, when it comes to sustainable finance as a concept, is there any specific thing about this area that you learned that maybe was your favorite lesson? Alex?
I think one of the things that I very much enjoyed was how forward-looking it is. So I think a lot of roles that you might take, and perhaps in more traditional finance roles, it's much more focused on day-to-day operations and just keeping up with things that come in. And while that is also part of it, I think it's very cool how we're trying to imagine what the world would look like, not only in 2 years or 3 years, but in 10 and 15 years, and then seeing what kind of things will play a big role there, and just trying to take this thing which is very abstract and boil it down to what can we do today and what type of things are worth looking at today in order to be to have a competitive edge in 10 years. And I think that was a very good learning experience for us.
And Sam?
Yeah, I have to agree with Alex. I have to say that I was very surprised at how like our product offerings and how it doesn't just cover only energy. Like, it goes beyond that. It goes to different industries, and we also have our social products. And I think that we're quite innovative in that aspect, that we're thinking way far ahead into the future. And I think that's what makes us stand out in this department, which was also something that I didn't expect coming into this internship. So it was a very pleasant surprise and a really cool lesson to learn throughout this entire internship.
And Lily?
So what I was really mesmerized by was in this team, it's really, like they said, like at the forefront of research, because you research the new products instead of, like, for example, in financial advisory, you more like pitch the products. So I really enjoy being in sustainable finance because the research we did actually contributed to developing these products.
I want to now go back to you, Sam, and talk a little bit more about the topic of social, because that's something that you worked with, and I'm not surprised that you also mentioned it earlier. So what place do social issues have in sustainable finance?
I personally, and maybe this is an unpopular opinion, but it's what I've come to conclude myself through this internship, is that social has as much of a place as the environmental side when it comes to sustainable finance products. I think that there's such a large interplay that we don't really see because social is quite hard to quantify. It's not as quantifiable in the same way that these environmental issues that we are dealing with. And I'm not saying that's an easy thing to do either. It's just more so when you're dealing with people and things like mental health or housing or education. These things are less hard to quantify, which makes it more difficult to understand. But that being said, you have this interplay of the environmental side and the social, and people tend to treat the environment better when they themselves have better treatment. If they have better education, they will know, okay, well, maybe I shouldn't go and pollute, just as a minor example. So I think there's a lot to say when it comes to social, and the interplay is huge, and we are just starting to realize this now. And I think I've realized a lot through the work that I've done this summer that social is kind of starting to be talked about, and I think there's a lot of special things that's going to happen in the future when it comes to that.
Definitely. And I mean, when we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, we see that there are probably more. I don't remember them off the top of my head, but I think there are more goals that are actually focusing on social issues rather than environment. So it's kind of uncanny that we talk so much about the environment and especially greenhouse gas emissions when we talk about sustainable finance. But like you said, that's because it's so much easier to quantify than social issues. But nevertheless, it is just as important, if not more, because like you said, they are so interconnected. So what type of specific topics have you looked at when it comes to social?
Yeah, so this summer I was looking a lot at social housing. Here in Sweden, we don't have any social housing. And so what I was looking at was the differences of this country to country, especially in Europe. And this is why the concept itself is so difficult, is that it doesn't have a standard program. It varies greatly, from what exists in, for example, Finland to France or to Austria. There's so many different tweaks of what this looks like. And so social housing itself was a really cool thing to look at because we don't have it here in Sweden.
I can imagine that some of our listeners will think, well, wait a minute, why does a Swedish bank ask their summer intern to look into social housing if Sweden doesn't even have social housing? So what type of research did you do? What kind of information were you looking for?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, well, we were looking at the poverty levels basically in the EU in the past few years, and it's some of the highest they've ever been, which is quite shocking. So basically, housing is not keeping up to how like people are earning income, and as a result, like we're seeing a lot of people on the streets. A lot of people just they don't have a place to live, and it's contributing to society negatively, right? It's not just about those individuals, but it's about neighborhoods. And that's why whenever we talk about social, and specifically social housing, we say that social is local. And I think this is a lot of where people get confused on the topic of social itself. They think, okay, if I invest in the global south, that's a good enough social investment. And that's fair. You should definitely invest in the global south. I'm not saying not to do that, but you have to invest in your own communities as well. We're strength in numbers, and we need to have better societies to be able to prosper. And that starts with social investments.
I like that you mentioned investments, because that's exactly where sustainable finance comes in, isn't it? So what type of research did you do when it comes to sustainable finance and investments in this area?
Absolutely. So I was doing investor mapping. I was making an investor universe, looking at asset managers and asset owners, seeing what they're interested in terms of social, how they communicate it. Do they have any investments in social bonds, any funds? Do they have any projects on the go in terms of affordable or social housing? And this was a key thing in my research this summer, was that you have this term thrown around, affordable housing. And there's a lot of investments in affordable housing, but there's significantly less when it comes to social housing. And I think actually there's probably more social projects out there than you think. People just get the term confused and they just call it affordable. And that's just because the way it's defined is not necessarily that clear. And that goes again with how it varies program to program by country. But what I was looking at was, okay, well, we have these asset managers and we have these asset owners, and what have they done? Do they have any interest at all? And what I saw was that out of the ones that did have interest in affordable or social housing, more so they were on the asset owner side. There were 3 projects out of 30 investors that I looked at that actually were attached to social. It was communicated as social. But 3 out of 30 was quite low, and in a group that I didn't necessarily expect. it was quite surprising. And again, I think this comes to the fact that people don't know how to deal with social. There was a lot on the side where the communication was, we are interested in social in the future, but it was largely dominated by green financing and green investments. So yeah, I think it's very much something that we'll see rise in the future. But right now, it was still quite in its infancy in terms of what was out there.
Thank you, Sam. I think this is a great exemplification of our team's motto of finding the challenges within sustainability that exist in society and trying to think of how we can address them through sustainable finance. All right, and now moving on to Alexander. You looked into the topic of transition and related concepts, and our listeners will be very familiar with the word because this is something that we say quite often on the podcast, transition this, transition that. Why is this topic so important in the context of sustainable finance?
I think that just in terms of definition, transition finance, I mean, it aims to allocate more capital towards what we consider green projects or projects that are turning green. So I think the reason why it's important is to just be able to finance projects that wouldn't be necessarily classified as green, but that are on the right path towards becoming green. And I mean, there are a lot of different financial instruments and things we can invest in that are green and that promote purely green projects, but we mustn't forget the projects that are on the path to getting there, but that are equally as important to shift the economy towards renewables. So I think that is why it's important.
Definitely, and this is something that we really need to get to the sustainable future that we are trying to get to. So what did you learn about the state of transition, we can say now?
I learned a lot of things. I think the first thing that I learned was that there is a huge demand from the market to wanting to invest in transition, but the supply is not really keeping up. So what I've been looking at a bit is what do the value chains look like for different technologies that might be important for the transition. And sort of what are possible bottlenecks in that value chain, so we make sure that the capital is not only flowing towards projects that already are well financed or that are sort of at the end of these value chains, but also on the also highlighting the different companies, but also different technologies that are further back in the value chain, but that are equally as important. So I've been working a bit on mapping that and seeing what kind of technologies could play a bigger role in the transition finance universe and what we should be focusing on.
Thank you so much, Alex. So, Lily, you study biotechnology. What does biotechnology even mean?
So one definition could be how we can utilize organisms and cell to create these products or services we desire. For example, it can be using bacteria. During my time at KTH, we grew a lot of bacteria on agar plates. We worked with antibiotics. We worked with modifying genes, mutagenesis, and so on and so forth.
Wow, that sounds extremely interesting and also extremely complicated. And I think a lot of our listeners will have a very valid question of how does someone studying biotechnology decide to do a internship in the bank? And does someone studying biotechnology have a place in sustainable finance?
So that's a really good question because in the beginning, before the internship, I could not see myself at a bank. I wasn't sure what I would be doing. Would I be sitting on the sidelines? I didn't really know how I could contribute, but I was really curious about the culture at a bank, but also how does a bank work with sustainability? Because I felt like working at a bank, you would get the financial part, but I really didn't want to throw away my education. I still wanted to work with sustainability. So that's why I applied for the internship. And something I realize now, for example, during like a client meeting, I see my potential. I see how I can contribute in discussions, for example. Maybe the people that study the financial, like the people with economic background, they would ask questions related to the project, like how is the economic feasibility, while I would ask maybe more technical questions, more questions related to chemistry that's still super relevant for the project, and how is that like technologically feasible, and push the discussion forward. And I think all of that really contributes to the realization of the project.
Absolutely. And I think if you were to ask me what the cool thing about sustainable finance is, I would say that is exactly my answer, that it can bridge so many different disciplines together, and everyone really has a role to play. So I think it's really, really cool that you've been here. It's been cool to have you in the team. And I know that one of the among the different topics you looked into was water quality and eutrophication. So could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. It's actually one of the projects I'm really proud of, and something I'm passionate about. So, one of the projects I was assigned to was investigating the Baltic Sea. And as you might know, the Baltic Sea is today one of the most polluted seas. And one of the things driving this pollution is eutrophication. And that's because we have these excessive levels of phosphorus. Sources of phosphorus can come from external sources, such as from agriculture runoff, from individual sewage, from industries, and from wastewater treatment plants. But a large part of the phosphorus in the Baltic Sea also comes from something called the internal phosphorus source. So that's like phosphorus that has been sedimented. They are sequestered in the sediments, but due to eutrophication causing these very low oxygen conditions in the bottom of the sea, the phosphorus is released back from the sediments to the water. So we have this loading of phosphorus coming out. So I looked a bit on how can we tackle the internal phosphorus loading, and that is one topic that has been really hard to tackle compared to maybe the external phosphorus loading. And that's because there's a lot of rebound effect stats that we don't really have data on, that we really don't know what are the negative impacts.
I mean, that is really interesting also for me as someone who has studied sustainability, but I bet a lot of people will ask then why would SEB, a bank, be interested in this type of information?
Yes, we have a lot of industries like tourism and fisheries that rely on the Baltic Sea, and not to mention the 90 million people living in the Baltic Sea region that is dependent, their livelihood depend on the Baltic Sea. And for SEB, there's a really big growth potential in the Baltic Sea. It can generate a lot of income, a lot of economic benefits, and employment benefits. So I would say that's a really something worth looking into.
Yes, definitely. And it's not only the environmental importance of the Baltic Sea, but also the economic importance of the Baltic Sea, like you said, that can't really be understated for the region. And that's exactly, like you said, where the financial institutions' role as a stakeholder comes into play. And SEB is, of course, an example of such a stakeholder. And when it comes to the Baltic Sea, maybe especially compared to some of the other projects we work on, it is in very, very early stages. So I mentioned earlier that our goal in the team is to identify challenges and see how we can address them through sustainable finance. So when it comes to the Baltic Sea, perhaps we are a little bit more on the identifying challenges.
Yeah, and I think as a bank, we have the responsibility to make sure that the capital is allocated to sustainable project.
Thank you so much, Lili.
Thank you.
And thank you to all of you. Before I let you go, I usually ask all of our guests if they could give a piece of advice to anyone working in finance, for example, in other areas of business, about how they can integrate sustainability in what they do. And I'm wondering what your perspective on that would be after your internship. So, Sam, if you would like to start.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the biggest tip that I can give is to read the science, both the environmental science and the social science, get a taste for what's going on. There's a lot of innovation out there. Get to know the technologies, because there's so much that we can use to drive progress towards tackling this huge issue. I also would say that it's important to not get caught up in the term of ESG and to look beyond that, because I think that's where a lot of people get trapped when it comes to sustainable finance. And that's also because there's not a lot of standardized methodologies of how you calculate ESG scores. So be mindful of where you're getting your information from, what the methodologies behind it are, and definitely read the science.
Thank you. Alex?
I think my main tip would be to keep an open mind and to be forward looking. So I think a lot of the solutions that we see now may definitely be part of the whole picture. But there might also be solutions that come up, and one thing that works for one company might not work for another. So just to keep an open mind and to see what's best for us. And then also to be very forward looking and try to see where do you want to be in 10 or 15 years and how are we going to get there. So just planning ahead and having that time horizon be a bit further than you're comfortable with, and then just trying to work consistently towards that. And I think if you do that, you're definitely well on the way, and you're going to be well positioned against your peers to get to where you want to be.
Another great advice. Thank you. And Lily?
I'm kind of in the same track as Alex. It's hard to tackle everything at once. So start identifying the issue, the problem, and work with baby steps. Start with a small problem and then kind of scale it up and start taking more measures.
Couldn't agree more. It's by the baby steps that we can get really far away, isn't it?
Exactly.
But thank you all again so very much for joining me in the studio today and for joining our team this summer. It's been a pleasure, and I wish you best of luck in the rest of your studies. And thank you, as always, to our listeners for tuning in. As always, you can reach out to us with any questions or suggestions for future episodes at nextgenfin@seb.se. And please don't forget to like or follow the podcast, depending on where you're listening, so that you are always updated when new episodes come out. But for now, take care and goodbye.